Welcome to Forest Ecology in fall 2020. Let's get right into it. We begin the class by talking about ecological concepts and then in the context of forests. And there are a few things before we get into those ecological concepts that I want to emphasize right from the start because they come up again and again throughout the class. Almost across the entire globe, three factors limit the distribution, the productivity, and the structure and composition. That is the species presence as well as the height or density of forests or their basal area, so forth. And those three factors are water, light, and nutrients. Now look across the world. Look across something smaller. Look across the U.S. and you're going to find examples where each of these is more important than the other. But by and large, it is these three factors that, as I say, come up again and again. Yes, biological agents and management also play a very important role. We're going to talk about that. But usually in the context of some other kind of limitation. For example, water. That's the one that's so obvious living in the West. Water, the distribution of precipitation, the availability of water influences what tree species we see in an area, whether we have forest or not, and how productive those forests are. So let's talk about a few other things here. Light limitation. In many forests, especially where nutrients and water are not limiting, and this also happens in the West, such as in the Pacific Northwest or Northern California, where this photograph is from, light limitation quickly becomes a key resource that is going to structure forests. Now, like I say, Northern California, adequate nutrients, adequate water, and the forest, under those conditions, forests will grow to the point that they maximize light capture, and much of the interaction of individual trees, and whether you have the dominance of the hardwood components, which you see here in the lighter green, or whether you have conifers, is going to be driven by how much light those individual species are getting. So here we are in California, and we have already two examples. Now, nutrients especially getting out of California and the western U.S., many forests are actually limited by critical soil nutrients. Go to New England, important forests in many respects, economically, socially, so forth. Those forests are limited by a suite of nutrients that constrain growth. Another example are other areas in the temperate world. This example here is from New Zealand. Many areas, different nutrients in different places in soil will limit whether you have forests and what trees are dominating there. Now, as I mentioned, moisture is the most common limiting factor in the western U.S. This occurs because of broad patterns in precipitation. It also occurs because of differences in soil. So here's the Seven Gables area in the eastern Sierra at pretty high elevation. This is white bark pine, taken at an elevation of about 10,000 feet. It's a relatively dry, it's a cold area, and it is relatively dry, but it is also a forested area where the soils are just not very deep. They're not very fine. There's a lot of coarse material, rocks and so forth, and moisture is limiting for more than one reason here. Many different kinds of contexts where this can happen. Some of the things that forests have to do, or individual trees have to do to survive in a particular locale, especially when it's cold, is to alter growth and reproduction. And one of the ways that trees deal with, especially with cold climate, but also with drought, seasonal drought, is senescence. So simply shedding leaf material in order to avoid some sort of stressful condition like a frost. Sometimes it makes evolutionary sense to shed foliage or shed organs of plants rather than invest in them to survive, say, a cold winter. So look across the West, look across many different forests, you're going to see different kinds of responses, including within your responses to differences in moisture as well as temperature and sometimes light. Much of what we're going to talk about, especially at the beginning of the class and going over different kinds of forest types, addresses this pretty obvious pattern difference between different kinds of forests, and that is whether trees annually senesce or whether they are evergreen. And oftentimes, for the most part, we can predict that based on the amount of precipitation that an individual area receives and when it receives it. Particularly winter precipitation tends to favor evergreen habits, so pines and other conifers. And this is White Mountain. This is to the east of the Sierra Nevada. It's where the ancient bristlecone pine forests, or some of the ancient bristlecone pine forests are. Interesting thing is that you actually see both evergreen and broadleaf species here, and that's because there is an interaction between moisture availability that's topographically driven, as well as some aspects of occasional summer rains in this area. So you have the species mix. Last thing I want to just point out, and it's kind of obvious, it's pretty obvious, especially when you look at annual systems, and that's not what we focus on here, but interannual variability, year-to-year differences in precipitation temperature, the timing of precipitation, it influences plant distributions, it influences the communities, and although it's pretty obvious with annual plant communities, even forest trees will respond to this, and they will respond to it particularly with things like seed crops, production of acorns, production of nuts, and so forth. And those things all influence everything else that you might care about in forests, such as the dynamics of wildlife, the regeneration in a stand that might be used for timber, as well as other kinds of things that you might not expect, like regeneration that can influence fuels and fire dynamics and so forth. We will get to the problem of people, not just in the sense of management, how to do it and how to make it effective, but also how the history of human civilization has influenced our forests, and sometimes to our detriment, to the detriment of sustainability of those systems. There are many things that have happened, from broad-spread clearance to the removal of different kinds of components of forests like predators and so forth. There are some etchings from the British Museum depicting the removal of big predators. You can see the effects of history in many different places. This is local. This is lime kiln, where redwood was removed to create charcoal and to fire kiln furnaces, lime kiln furnaces for the production of concrete. That's a pretty local example, and it also was one of the drivers of loss of old-growth forest in the southern range of redwood distribution. There's still some left, but much of it is gone. As well as other things that are really striking, such as the clearance of land for extensive agriculture. The Mayan megacities are a good example, as are much of the Mississippian culture pre-colonial or pre-European contact in North America. Extensive clearing of land, as well as clearing of land in the East Coast prior to opening of roads between the cities on the eastern seaboard and the Ohio River Valley. Extensive clearing of land abandonment, and that history affects the distribution of forests that we have today. And I know I would be remiss if I didn't also mention pollution and other kinds of degradation of forests that that occur because of human development. And within this, I would include invasive species, including invasive diseases and invasive insects, as well as other kinds of chemical pollution or loss of topsoil. We'll come back to these. I just want to acknowledge right now that they occur. And here's another example. The previous one was from Oaxaca, Mexico, but here is the American River near its confluence with the Sacramento River. And look around and you're going to find impacts in cities where people congregate. You're going to find different kinds of contamination in this boat that's been abandoned here on the shores of the American River is an example of that. Degradation of important riparian forests in these communities. So, several different concepts there. We are going to revisit them, look at them in greater detail, and we will also come back to many of these themes because they come up again and again in all kinds of ways that we care about in ecology and specifically